In the fall of the 13th century, the road was a viscous mess, and the cold crept through the coarse, homespun cloth like steel under fingernails. The winds drove clouds from the north, and beneath them was a man in a shabby caftan, with a knot at his back and eyes that held more fear than hope. He was not a merchant, he had no horse or silver coins, only need and weariness. The village was far behind, the unfamiliar road ahead, and with each step the question became more and more acute. Where to spend the night? When the sun was slipping toward the horizon, and there was no tavern or familiar courtyard ahead, where did he go who had no money and no name that meant anything in a foreign land? Where was a man who could not pay in word or gold, looking for a roof over his head? The story of a poor traveler in the Middle Ages is not about the romance of wandering, but about the struggle for life. The journey through forests, fields, and hostile villages was an ordeal in which every night could be the last. Why did the peasants set out in the first place? The journey for a poor peasant in the Middle Ages was rarely a choice. More often, it was a necessity dictated by hunger, poverty, or the will of the Lord. In the fall, he could be sent to the prince's fair, not for shopping, but to pay tribute or sell an extra measure of turnips. In the spring, he could drive cattle to new lands, or, when called to cut wood, go to a neighboring volost for day labor in order to get a handful of salt. In the most difficult years, the village died of starvation, and then whole families left their homes, going to the places where, as they said, there was still rye left. Pilgrimage was a special occasion. The journey to a shrine, for example, to the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, or to the relics of a local saint, could last for weeks. Often it became the only way to beg forgiveness for fleeing from the bar's fiefdom, because escape was considered a crime. The fugitive peasant walked, ducking to the ground, along country roads, hiding from the eyes of headmen and clerks. In times of strife and the Mongol Tatar threat, many people were forced to join the militia, and not everyone found their way back after a battle. When he set out on his journey, he did not know where he would spend the night, what he would eat, or whom he would trust in a strange land. He had no map, no luggage, only a shoulder bag with dry bread and an icon sewn to his hem. He walked, relying on intuition, on ancient paths that had been traveled by the same nameless shadows before him. The journey itself became a test. A storm could catch him in a clear field, and dashing men hid at crossings and on forest roads. Enemies were not only outside. A disease caught from dirty water or damp wind could kill a strong man overnight. According to Novgorod Chronicles, whole groups of pilgrims died on the way, from cholera, from hunger, from wounds. Many had no shoes and they walked barefoot on stony roads, rubbing tar and ash into the cracks of their skin to somehow relieve the pain. Yet the peasant rarely complained. The road was part of life, almost like spring crops. Sometimes he never returned, and only the old woman at the edge of the village knew that her grandson might have become a monk in a distant monastery, or perhaps he had lain down in the forest by the roots of an oak tree, without a cross or a prayer. Each road was like a border between the living and the dead world, and to cross it was to challenge not only fate, but also oneself. The whole journey was filled with fears, prayers, and quiet hope. Maybe somewhere ahead there would be a warm hearth and a kind look. But more often than not, the peasant knew that one can only hope for what one carries within oneself: strength, patience, and the ability to survive amidst the cold and indifference of the road. The forest is the first and most dangerous shelter. The forest was the first and most accessible refuge for a poor peasant on a journey, especially in summer or early fall, when the grass was still warm and the leaves were thickly hidden from view. They made a halt on the outskirts of the thicket, away from the paths where sentries or travelers with bad intentions could walk. They chose a place with dry bedding, a layer of old spruce needles or last year's leaves. The fire was built carefully, not so much for warmth as to scare away animals: wolves, lynx, or stray dogs. The smoke rose low, and the branches overhead prevented it from giving away the traveler. For in the forest, the danger came not only from beasts, but also from other people: robbers, fugitive villains, embittered and desperate. They slept in their outer clothes covered with a straw mat or a simple woolen cloak. Sometimes they threw fresh grass over themselves to hide not only from the rain, but also from their eyes if a branch cracked behind them. The forest nights were cold and damp, even in the height of summer, and in spring and fall, they were deadly dank. Those who had the skill built primitive tents of thin branches and moss, using old hunting techniques. Historians have found descriptions of such shelters in peasant records of the 17th century, especially among Novgorodians, who went into the forests from want and thievery. Sometimes it was possible to find an abandoned forest camp or the remains of a campfire. Then a person felt less lonely, although it did not mean that he was safe. The peasants knew that the forest was like a foreign city. Every corner had its own life, and a mistake could be costly. Heavy rains could start, the downpour would flood the fire, and the water would collect in holes under the body, penetrating into boots and clothes. On such nights they did not sleep, sat wrapped up in themselves, and only listened to the forest. How a twig cracked, how an owl hooted, how something invisible was sneaking in the bushes. There were cases when awakened travelers found claw marks or even bare dung nearby, and it was considered lucky if the beast had passed by. The old peasants taught, "Don't sleep in the same place twice. The forest remembers and calls others." So at dawn, they would hurriedly pack up and leave, even if they had not rested properly. The forest was both a shelter and a trap. It saved them from the cold, but it could not let them go. And yet, having no other choice, the peasant went into the thicket, where he could hide from the eyes of others and lurk for one long night full of sounds and fears. Barns, and abandoned structures. On long journeys, when the forest became too dangerous and his strength was failing, the poor peasant would look for another shelter, a barn, an empty stable, or a dilapidated mill. Such buildings, even dilapidated and rotten, seemed almost a luxury after the damp litter in the forest. Sometimes they found old hunting huts abandoned for the winter, or shepherds' huts left behind during the cold season. They still retained some warmth and the smell of smoke. If they were unlucky enough to find an empty building, they would go to the edge of the courtyard of a peasant farm, hoping that the owner would allow them to spend the night in the barn. It was a risk. A vagrant or a wanderer was distrusted, and if you tried to get in without permission, you could be beaten with a stick or even thrown out into the cold. However, necessity took its toll. Historians note that such overnight stays were common in the northern and eastern lands of Russia, especially along trade and pilgrimage roads. They slept on straw or just on the bare boardwalk, next to grain sacks, rusty tools, and horse harness, if there was any left. Often mice and rats kept them company, but the peasant was not afraid of that. The main thing was a roof over his head. Often the smell of rot, dampness, and animal dung was so strong that it made one dizzy, but the warmth still outweighed the disgust. Sometimes an old blanket or rags could be found in a corner. Such places were kept safe, and they told each other about them if the road fell again. Abandoned buildings sometimes became temporary shelters for entire groups of beggars fleeing war or famine. Dozens of stories could be heard in such places, each with its own way, its own misfortune. Sometimes unpleasant surprises were found. Robbers also used these hiding places, and a traveler opening the door could find himself face to face with danger. Sometimes it was necessary to share a night's lodging with sick, contagious, or simply crazy people who had been thrown out of the village by life. During the time of troubles and Crimean raids, many peasants fleeing the massacres sought shelter in abandoned buildings. To this day, archaeologists still find objects left in a hurry in old mills and barns: charred bones, torn laptops, clay mugs. Such overnight stays were not a choice, but a forced measure, an attempt to survive among merciless nature and indifferent people. But in these walls, even without windows and doors, there was at least some protection from wind and rain, and the moment a man closed his eyes trying not to think about tomorrow, this barn became home for one single night. Parish yards and church buildings. In the midst of cold, hunger, and fear, the wanderer's road led to the place where there was hope, to the church, to the monastery, to the shelter of the churchyard. The temple was not only a place of prayer, but also the only shelter in the area, where an occasional traveler could count on protection from bad weather and human cruelty. Those who walked with a cross, with an icon on their chest, pilgrims, seekers of holy places, atoning for sins, were especially willingly accepted. In such travelers, they saw not just poor people, but people who bore the seal of God's admonition. For one night, they could go to a warm corner of the monastery refectory or to a barn where supplies were kept. Sometimes they gave a bowl of lean soup, a crust of bread, and warm water. But not always. Monasteries were obliged to feed their own monks, workers, servants, and if hunger was acute, a traveler could simply not be allowed out of the gates. In parish churches, shelter was even more unpredictable. Everything depended on the mood of the rector and the number of people asking. Historians find references to the fact that in large monasteries, such as Kirillo-Belozersky or Solovetsky, there were even special guest cells for wanderers. However, such facilities were rare and were located in remote places where it was almost impossible for an ordinary peasant to reach. More often, he knocked on the wooden gate of the village church, hoping for a warm word and a bowl of porridge. Village deacons and monks saw helping their neighbors as a duty to God, but at the same time, they tried not to make the temple a shelter for everyone. They could be shouted at or even thrown out of the gates for asking too much. Tired, ragged, barefoot, such people were a familiar part of the church landscape, but not always welcome. Space was scarce, and there were too many people in need. Often a wanderer helped the monastery or parish with work, chopping wood, carrying water, mending fences. For this, he could get a night's lodging in the back room or even in the cell of an old minister. Sometimes the blessing on the way was accompanied by a modest bundle. It could contain a dried root, a couple of handfuls of groats, a few rowan berries. It was more than food. It was a sign that one was not alone on the road. The churchyard could also be a place of death. In winter, those who could not find a corner froze in the snowdrifts under the fence. But it was here that a peasant traveler, exhausted and weakened, most often sought refuge. Here was a chance, even if only for one night, even if it was on a stone floor among strangers. Here sometimes there was a whispered prayer, like the last warmth in his chest. Other peasants' houses are on the way. Sometimes the road led the traveler to a flimsy hut with a smoky stove and the smell of sour bread. And then a game of survival built on hope and peasant solidarity began. In an era when every day could end in disaster, a stranger on the doorstep was not only a request for help, but also a potential threat. Thieves, deserter soldiers, lepers were feared. But still, especially in remote villages where strangers were rare, a traveler could open the door. They did not receive them immediately. First, they asked questions, made eye contact, and asked to see an icon or a letter from the priest. If a person was trustworthy, they would let him sleep in the hay or on a bench by the stove. It was warm there, smelling of wood, smoke, and cabbage. Peasants shared what they had: a crust of bread, a spoonful of warm chowder, sometimes a mug of kvass. This was not hospitality in the usual sense. It was a struggle with conscience and fear, with hunger and commandments. Historians note that in the northern regions, where the distances between settlements were especially great, the tradition of welcoming travelers was kept longer. In central Russia, especially during the famine years, the doors were more often closed. Much depended on the time of year. In the fall, when the harvest was in full swing, people were kinder. In the spring, when supplies were running low, they were chased from the doorstep. Sometimes the traveler helped, mending the fence, patching the roof, bringing water, and for this he received a night's lodging. Sometimes he was accepted only because the hostess remembered how her son had once slept in someone else's hut when he went to the army. There were also cases when such people were cheated, beaten, or handed over to the guards, especially if there were rumors of robberies in the district. The house of a simple peasant was small, most often one room, a stove, a couple of benches, a chest of rags. But it was here, under the shivering light of the beam, that the traveler felt a rare warmth, not only bodily, but also human. In these walls did not expect gratitude, but did not demand it. Help was a matter of the heart, not of duty. And everyone who had ever knocked on such a door knew that if they opened it, you were saved, if only for one night. Wandering communities and seasonal camps. When the road became longer than strength and the loneliness more dangerous than the cold, the travelers began to gather in small groups. This was especially common near large fairs, monasteries, or places of pilgrimage. Wherever the paths converged, temporary camps that resembled actual camps appeared. People gathered by kinship, by compatriotism, by chance. Poor people, hermits, peasants in search of income, widows, children, cripples. The common need united them. Tents made of canvas, sheepskins, or even torn doors appeared in meadows or by the roadside. Some took shelter under a cart. Others built primitive shelters of twigs and bark. Life was boiling in such camps. Boiling water on stones, fires made of raw brushwood, smoke, children's crying, crackling of dried peas in a cauldron. They exchanged shoes for onions, wool for groats, stories for silent help. Some of these camps existed for years. For example, on the approaches to the famous Makariev Fair in Nizhny Novgorod land, or near the Solovetsky Monastery. Entire villages without residence registration appeared there, where beggars, hermits, and those who were looking for a place to wait out the winter flocked. At night, the camps were frightened by howling winds, coughs, and sometimes drunken screams. People were different, and yet amidst the soot and cold, there was room for humanity. Someone to share a piece of bread, someone to pray over a dying man, someone to tell news from the south. The camps were dangerous. Disease spread instantly, from a single cold to an epidemic in a matter of days. Fever, diarrhea, plague, everything went round and round, especially in spring, when everything was rotting, but food was scarce. Sometimes officials or soldiers came to such places and dispersed them, burning the campsites, chasing people away. They were called vagrant tabor. Although it had nothing to do with gypsies or nomads, it was survival, not a way of life. Many camps sprang up spontaneously in places where someone had already died, someone had already escaped, someone had already laid out their last handful of moss to sleep on. People said that camps were like fishing nets. They held back those who were swept away by the current. They found help, they found fear, they found a reminder that everyone was equally vulnerable to hunger and the road. There was no hierarchy there, only mutual need. In such temporary settlements, children were born and old people died. In every fire, every tent, every bundle of belongings was a cry that one wanted to live, no matter what. Rest at roadside crosses and chapels. Travelers and wanderers, especially peasants, often sought shelter at roadside crosses and small chapels, which in Russia have always been considered holy and protected places. These structures were erected at the crossroads of roads or on the borders of villages to protect travelers and bless their way. People believed that even the most dangerous robbers and beasts would bypass the place where a cross or a small church stood. The shrine was a kind of protection on the road. At such crosses, there was usually a well or a spring with water, which was a real salvation for a traveler. Fresh water on the way could solve the question of survival. Tired and exhausted travelers often took a break here, shook off the dust of the road and drank cold water, gaining strength for the next crossing. Many left offerings, a piece of bread, a bundle of healing herbs, a lit candle, to receive the blessing and protection of the saints. They slept at the foot of the cross or at the walls of the chapel, covering themselves with a cloak or a rough cloth, trying to keep warm on a cold night. Often these places were the last refuge of the weary traveler. There were no houses or other shelters nearby, and the hour-long prayers before going to bed were both a plea for protection and an acknowledgement of one's own vulnerability. Historical chronicles of the time mention that crosses on the roads were placed precisely to alleviate the plight of poor and lonely travelers, for they were the most vulnerable. Folk belief said that if you hear the church bell ringing at the chapel at night, it means that angels are guarding the way of a traveler. Sometimes wandering traders gathered under these crosses to park their carts at night and guard their goods. More often than not, however, the peace of the roadside crosses was precarious. Strong winds dispersed the smoke of the fires, and wild beasts nearby reminded of the constant threat. The travelers told each other that here at the crosses, one could feel not only fear and fatigue, but also quiet hope. It was not in vain that in these places many people found the strength to reach their destination. In chronicles, there are often mentions of how road guards, monks and church officials, sent help to tired peasant caravans from these very places. The sacred signs served not only as spiritual protection, but also as a guide for those who got lost or did not know the way. At night, candles were lit at the crosses, burning through the darkness and drizzle like beacons on the path of the desperate. These tiny lights seemed a symbol of life and hope in the cold, desolate steppes and forests. Legends had it that under these crosses, the soul of a traveler could find peace, even if the body was exhausted from hunger and cold. People were afraid to stop far from such shrines because the fear of spirits and unclean forces was great. And yet, despite the difficulties and dangers, the peasants realized that here, at the crosses and chapels, they had a small support that they could not find alone on the forest road or in the wasteland. This weak defense, however fragile, became for them sometimes the only hope for salvation in a world where the road was full of trials. Under bridges and by the side of the road, especially in the vicinity of large cities and commercial centers, where space for sleeping was disastrously scarce, poor peasants and wanderers often had no other choice but to camp under bridges or right by the roadside. Here, in the open air, they slept, covered with whatever they could, cloaks, rags, or simply curled up in a ball from the cold, and sometimes without a fire at all, for fear of attracting the attention of guards or robbers. Often these places became the last refuge for fugitive peasants, beggars, and vagabonds who could not afford even the modest roof of a monastery or a village hut. Overnighting under the bridge was extremely dangerous. The cold, dampness, constant noise and dust of the road, passing wagons, and an endless stream of people gave neither rest nor sleep. In winter, the situation became almost catastrophic. The freezing wind penetrated through the cracks, the ground froze to the depths, and the snow and rain made sleeping almost impossible without serious protection. In the annals of Ivan the Terrible's time, there are mentions of travelers freezing to death, sheltering under bridges where there was neither heat nor food. Often groups of beggars and homeless people gathered near these places, trying to band together for safety, albeit tenuous. Together they built weak fires using dry branches and leftover wood found on the roadside. But the fear of attack by bandits or townspeople who did not want to see strangers never left these camps. Sometimes sleeping under the bridge turned into a real nightmare. Fights, shouting, conflicts for the right of the first night by the fire. Historical documents show that fugitive peasants also often hid under bridges, avoiding return to their land, from where severe punishments or even death penalty could come. Their fate was in the balance. There was no protection or compassion here, only the harsh reality of survival. Such nights hardened the spirit, but often broke the body and soul. The chronicles mention cases where the city guards drove these people out, pouring cold water on them or threatening to kill them. It was in such conditions that the strongest ties between the poor and vagrants were formed. Joint survival on the edge of society brought them closer together and created peculiar communities of mutual aid. However, even here there was a continuous fear of disease. The cold and damp contributed to the rapid spread of plague, tuberculosis, and other infections. It was a world on the brink where every day could be the last. Nevertheless, despite all the hardships under bridges and by the roadside, one could see manifestations of human resilience and hope as travelers shared their last piece of bread, told each other stories, and prayed for salvation. It was here, at the very bottom of the social ladder, that an understanding of the fragility of life and the need for mutual support was sharpened. This was the harsh truth of the medieval roads, brutal, but at the same time filled with quiet heroism and endurance. Cities' overnight stays at the city gates. In medieval cities, the gates, surrounded by high walls and moats, were closed for the night on a strictly scheduled basis, usually at dusk, and those who were late found themselves outside the city, locked behind massive oak doors with iron bolts. Many poor travelers and peasants who did not have time to enter stayed the night at this very gate, forced to make a kind of camp on stones or the ground, covered with cloaks or scraps of cloth, trying to somehow protect themselves from the cold wind and dampness. In some cases, desperate travelers dug holes in the ground, shallow holes in which they could hide from sudden gusts of wind and partially shelter from rain or snow, using sticks and grass to create a temporary shelter. Historical chronicles of the 13th and 15th centuries mention that huge numbers of such night guests gathered at the gates of cities, often falling victim to robbers or wild animals, as there was no protection outside the city walls. Despite the constant danger, many preferred the risk to staying on the road with no shelter. Sometimes the city guards, showing a little compassion, allowed the latecomers to stay in the guardhouses, small gatehouses where at least they could shelter from the cold and get some water. However, such permission was a rare exception and depended on the mood of the guards, the degree of their pity or personal interest, because sleeping outside the walls meant less control over the situation inside the city. In the documents of the 16th century, there are complaints of the city authorities about the crowds of vagrants and poor people who gathered at the gates, creating a nuisance and sometimes becoming a source of disorder. It was here that one could see the most desperate stratum of society who found themselves on the very edge of the urban world, almost outside civilization. Many of these overnight stays were accompanied by a constant fear of the guards, who could expel or even beat the sleepers if they thought they were too noisy or suspicious. Silence reigned at the gate at night, broken only by the rustle of cloaks, quiet conversations, and the occasional growl of the dogs that guarded the city walls. For many, the night at the gate became a symbol of extreme poverty and hopelessness, when one's own home seemed distant and unattainable. Nevertheless, it was at these city gates that rare instances of mutual aid arose. Peasants shared a piece of bread while warming themselves at weak fires, exchanged news with passing traders, or received rare alms from charitable passers-by. In the late Middle Ages, primitive lodges for the poor began to appear at some city gates, but they were very few and not everyone could get there. In the open air, without a roof over their heads, the cold penetrated the bones in the morning, and the ground became damp and cold, and only heavy fatigue allowed people to get some sleep. Life at the gates was a constant struggle for survival, and each new day brought hope or a new set of challenges. Many who survived such nights returned to the villages with tales of the harsh reception of the city, which divided the world into insiders and outsiders, not only by origin, but also by wealth. These were the realities of the medieval world, a world where a night at the city gates could be both an escape and a sentence. Paid shelters if there was a coin in your pocket. In medieval Russian lands, there were inn and taverns for travelers, but for the majority of peasants and beggars, they remained an inaccessible luxury because even scarce coins rarely fell into their hands. And therefore, such establishments were visited mainly by merchants, officials, and wealthier people. Nevertheless, if any payment could be obtained, be it a copper coin, a precious knife, leather boots, or a woolen hat, it was accepted as payment for a night's lodging and food, allowing the poor man to forget for one night the risks of sleeping outdoors in the cold. Cheap inns were often cluttered, damp rooms with wooden benches and tables, crowded with peasants, peddlers, and vagrants, and smelling of dirt, sweat, and tobacco smoke, creating an atmosphere of chaos and unkemptness. Lice and other vermin were invariably present in such places, and drunkenness and swearing were common, which made the night not the most peaceful time, but nevertheless it was here that one could warm oneself by the fire and get a hot meal of vegetables or groats, which was often a rarity on the road. Historical sources of the 14th and 15th centuries contain references to such inns called hen yards or parking lots, where travelers could exchange their meager belongings for shelter and food. Although the conditions there were far from comfortable and often did not exceed the usual damp hut with a leaky roof, sometimes the owners of such places could be cruel and greedy, demanding more than they were entitled to, or throwing out those who could not pay, leaving people outside in the cold and bad weather. Sleeping in a paid shelter meant not only safety from wild animals and robbers, but also a chance to avoid the diseases that often plagued those who slept in the open. In some cities and large villages, special almshouses for the poor and wanderers were established at temples and monasteries, but access to them was not easy, and they did not always provide overnight accommodation for all those in need. Chronicles and hagiographies of saints sometimes describe cases when beggars and pilgrims found shelter with kind hosts, receiving not only shelter and food, but also spiritual support. However, for many of those who set off empty-handed, the only possibility was to pay with things, since coins were rare in village life, and trading on the road was a dangerous and unreliable occupation. Paid shelters became a temporary refuge where even short-term warmth and peace became worth as much as life. Yet despite the harshness of the conditions, the opportunity to hide from the rain, eat a hot meal, and rest on a wooden floor in a cramped room was considered a blessing that was sorely lacking on the long journey. Such overnight stays were not only a physical, but also a moral relief for the weary traveler, who knew that tomorrow he would have to face the dangers of the journey, hunger, and cold again. Historical documents confirm that even the poorest asylums sometimes had their own laws and traditions that maintained order and mutual respect among the guests. Paid lodgings, though modest in comfort, played an important role in the lives of medieval travelers, providing them with much-needed rest and a chance to regain their strength for the next leg of the journey. They were evidence of how, in a world full of hardship and risk, man tried to maintain at least a tiny island of safety and warmth where cold and hunger temporarily receded. Sometimes in particularly harsh winters, when the roads were blocked by snow and supplies were running low, inns became the last refuge for freezing travelers, allowing them to survive until spring. Legends and chronicles of those times tell of hosts who, despite the danger and poverty, opened their doors to their neighbors, sharing with them the last piece of bread and a handful of hot soup. At the same time, such places played the role of news and rumor centers, where travelers exchanged information about what was happening in distant lands, dangers on the roads, and political events. Paid shelters became not just places of lodging, but also nodes of communication in the vast network of medieval routes, where every traveler could feel a part of the big world. And although most peasants, poor and vagabonds, dreamed of a serene rest in a cozy home, it was such simple and rude lodgings that allowed them, for a moment, to find peace and strength to continue their long and difficult journey. The journey of a peasant in the Middle Ages is not just a road, it is a test of endurance, courage, and hope. Each night's lodging was a small victory over cold, hunger, and loneliness, each shelter an oasis in a world of danger and hardship. Traveling was not a luxury, but a struggle for survival, where even the humblest roof over one's head could be salvation. It is through such stories that you can feel the real life of those who lived in an era of darkness and change, understand their fears and dreams. If you are interested in the real story, full of truth, emotions, and vivid details, subscribe to our channel. There are many more fascinating stories about the lives and destinies of those who lived in ancient and medieval times. Don't miss new videos. Together, we will plunge into the past and rediscover it,